It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this morning's panel, Alexis Scott. Scott is a native Atlantan, the granddaughter of W.A. Scott II, the founder of the Atlanta Daily World, the nation's first Black-owned daily newspaper. She's a graduate of Booker T. Washington High School and went to attend Barnard College in New York and Spelman College here in Atlanta. She's a graduate of the Regional Leadership Institute and Leadership Atlanta. An accomplished journalist and publisher, Scott enjoyed a 22-year career in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and Cox Enterprises, working her way up from reporter to vice president of community affairs, and then served as director of diversity at Cox. She then became publisher of the Atlanta Daily World. She has spent the last 18 years serving as a featured commentator on the Georgia Gang, a weekly political program at Fox 5. She's active in the Atlanta nonprofit community and served in various boards, including the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, the Booker T. Washington Legacy Foundation, among others. We're honored to have her with us as moderator. Please join me in welcoming Alexis Scott.
Good morning. I'm going to lock this chair because I don't want to go rolling down these steps here. I appreciate your being here today, and I'm delighted to be here with you. Where is my notebook? Serena? Thank you. As the panelists come forward, we will begin our discussion. And I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to see you earlier, Charlayne. It's so good to see you always. I am a little bit incapacitated because I need a knee replacement, and I had one already, so I'm a little bit slow on the uptake today. But I'm with you, and I wouldn't have been anyplace else but here. And I did get a chance to say hello to Marilyn. And I think the reason that I am honored to be here primarily is because these two families have meant so much to me personally as well as to Atlanta and the world. And I've known about Charlayne Hunter probably we've known each other for more than 40 years. Okay. And I met her when I was a student at the Michelle Clark Fellowship Program, and she was a visiting lecturer, and she was a reporter at the New York Times at that time. And I have admired her, particularly been in awe of her courage. When I graduated from high school in 1966, my father took me over to the University of Georgia to see if that was something I wanted to do. And I got over there, I was completely overwhelmed by the whiteness. And I said, I can't do this, I'll never find a husband over here. But I also was intimidated by it too, because I had grown up in the segregated South. I had graduated from Booker T. Washington High School. I was valedictorian, but I just didn't have the courage to face what Charlayne had faced only a few years earlier. So I did not go there. I went to Barnard College in New York City. But the Hamilton Holmes family has been a part of my life, all my life. And I'm honored to be here today to talk about Hamilton's, and we call him Hamp's courage. His aunt Alice wrote for the Atlanta Daily World back in the 30s before I was born. So our families have known each other for, as I said, several generations. And Marilyn and I have gotten to know each other as members of the Chautauqua Circle Club. And we both came in at the same time. I know it was about 10 years or so ago, so I'm just really honored to be here with you. Now, as I'm talking, I want the panel members to come on and get up here on this stage so we can begin the conversation. Tom Johnson, Arthur Yancey. Did Valerie get here? Yes, come on, Valerie. Dr. Bootle?
Here.
Great. Dr. Cook, is she here? Good. And is it Judge Jones? See? Oh, thank you. All right.
We really needed better applause than that.
Thank you. Appreciate you pointing that out. And this is absolutely true because this is a stellar panel and it's going to be a wonderful conversation that we're going to have. I think I'd like to start, though, with Dr. James Bootle, who is the son of Judge Bootle, who gave the order to allow Charlayne and Hamilton Holmes to enter.
Thank you very much, and good morning. It's a privilege to be here. I had not met Charlayne until this morning, and also I met Marilyn Holmes. I did have the opportunity to meet Hamilton Holmes at Grady, and I'll like to tell about that a little bit later on. Charlayne was kind enough to call my sister. When my father passed away in 2005, I guess I didn't realize that you could make a phone call from South Africa to Macon, Georgia. She did, and it was a very nice thing to do.
It was probably paid for by CNN.
Well, good. I'm glad they spent their money wisely. But there were 7 towns that made up the Middle District of Georgia, and this was my father's district as U.S. District Judge. He would travel to each town in turn and hold court there. One of those towns was Athens, and that's the reason that this case came before him. It's one of the first things that happened when this ruling was made to desegregate the university in 1961. It was not universally popular. There was quite a bit of
That's probably the understatement of the day.
pushback, fallout, insults, threats. No one knows that better than the 2 honorees here today. But we had a little bit of that in Macon. The phone rang and my mother answered, and the voice said, tell Judge Bootle that there's a bomb under your house and it's going to go off in 30 minutes. My mother did not suffer fools gladly. She said, the judge is asleep. I'm not going to wake him up to tell him that. And besides, our house is built on a slab and there's no way you could put a bomb under it. On another occasion, this was actually, I'm jumping ahead, but after the University of Georgia, the first court assignment that my father had was in Emeritus. And so they went down there and somebody said, Judge, did they see that you were hanged in effigy here? And he said, no, I didn't know about that. Well, it turns out that the people that did it didn't know that there was a difference between the federal courthouse and the county courthouse, so they hanged him in front of the wrong courthouse. My mother said we had to get in the car and go over there and look at it, and there he was, swinging in the breeze. Well, one of the first things that happened is that the lawyers, after this decision was made, the lawyers for the university decided that they were going to appeal the case, and they asked for a supersedious. I had to look that up. That's not a word that I use, and I probably won't use it after today. But it means, of course, a delay in the implementation or the enactment of a ruling until such time as the Court of Appeals can hear it. Well, the Daddy had said that he normally would welcome a supersedious because even though he had made a studied decision, it never hurts to have another judge looking over your shoulder and saying, that's fine, everything's all right. In this case, he very much welcomed the supersedious because he knew that this was a momentous decision. It was going to change the course of history, and he wanted the backing, the affirmation of the higher court. So this was working according to plan. It turns out that he got that and a little bit more. Judge Elbert Tuttle at the time was on the Court of Appeals here in Atlanta. He ruled the very same day that this ruling was correct, appropriate, and that there was no need for a supersedious. Justice Hugo Black was on the Supreme Court. He ruled the following day in support of everything that Judge Tuttle had said. So the expression arose that this case had gone from Bootle to Tuttle to Black and back. And it all happened in a day and a half. Normally we hear that the wheels of justice grind slowly, but in this case they were moving along at a pretty good clip. And it seems that this case had attracted far more than local attention. The next thing that happened was that the governor of Georgia decided that he was going to have to close the university. He had made such a strong point of continued segregation in his gubernatorial campaign that he was just going to have to shut the school down. And this put my father in a rather awkward position of having to issue an injunction against the governor of Georgia, saying in effect, no, you cannot do that. The school must stay open, and these two highly qualified applicants must be admitted, as we have said. So that's the story in a nutshell. The rest is history. I should add probably that Governor Vandiver ultimately came around. I guess you have certain political obligations that you have to fulfill, but Daddy said later he had some kind things to say about Governor Vandiver. He said he thought that he had the common sense and the wisdom to realize that this was the right thing to do. Daddy said, I hoped he would, I thought he would, I prayed he would, and he did. This may be for my opening time is enough.
Wonderful, yes. And I want to remind the panelists to keep the mic close to your mouth so that we can make sure that we hear what you're saying. I've been reminded to do that myself. The next person I want to talk is Dr. Valerie Boyd. She is the Charlayne Hunter-Gault Distinguished Writer in Residence at the University of Georgia. And we'd like for you to make your opening comments, if you would.
Thank you, Alexis. Good morning, Charlayne. Good morning, Valerie. Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. I have the distinction of being the Charlayne Hunter-Gault Distinguished Writer in Residence at the University of Georgia. And it's an amazing honor for me as someone who grew up in Georgia and, was a child when Charlayne, was a baby when Charlayne was integrating the University of Georgia. And so growing up in Atlanta, her name was iconic in our home. And so it was always like, you can go to the University of Georgia now because of Charlayne Hunter-Gault. And I actually didn't go to the University of Georgia for undergrad. I went to Northwestern University. And my parents, who had never been to college, I'm first generation college, they were disappointed that I didn't go to the University of Georgia. But when I started teaching there, they were like, yeah, you finally made it to UGA. So I'm finally there. And I want to just say that I was asked to talk about Charlayne as a journalist and an activist. And those are not two words that you often see together. And so I'm delighted to be able to talk a little bit about that because those are two words that I like to put together when I talk to my students at UGA about the fact that you can be a journalist and still be a sensitive human being who has an opinion about the world in which we live. That you don't become, when you're a journalist, a reporting robot who doesn't care about what's going on in the world and who doesn't have emotion about what's going on in the world. So I just raised Charlayne's name in my class yesterday because we were talking about the fact that you can be a journalist and still weep at the death of an iconic athlete like Kobe Bryant or a musical icon like Aretha Franklin, because you are also a human being and a citizen of the world, and you care about things that everybody else cares about, and that those biases that you have as a human being, you need to be direct about and honest about, and those biases make you a fuller human being, and therefore, if you own those biases and embrace the fullness of who you are, you become then a better journalist. And I think that's the wonderful example that Charlayne has set for us all. And so we all contain multitudes, right? Like we are full, rich human beings who represent or who engage in a variety of ways and have enormous complexity. And so one of the projects that I've been working on that I just finished up is I've been editing the journals of Alice Walker, the great American novelist, author of The Color Purple. And in the past couple of weeks, I've been just rereading everything with deep focus and trimming out unnecessary journal entries and all of that. Alice Walker started keeping journals when she was 18. Next week, she'll turn 76. And so it's all these decades of her journals, and I've had the opportunity to read them and edit them for a book that will come out at the end of this year. And so in rereading everything with such focus, I ran across an entry that mentions Charlayne Hunter-Gault. And I want to read that entry to you now, because I think the entry talks about the fact that we contain multitudes, and it's Alice's observations about Charlayne. So Charlayne has never heard this. This is in Alice Walker's personal journals, so nobody has ever heard this. But she wrote, this was on February 14th, 1987. And Alice Walker wrote, Charlayne Hunter just left after an interview for McNeil Lehrer. All I'm really thinking about as these camera sound people work on this shot of me writing is whether I'll look really fat in this sweater. Such trivia. The interview was interesting, even fun. Charlayne is funny. Such an effervescent Gibson girl. Southern belle, but tough-minded type. With really elegant clothes. By comparison, I feel dowdy. So odd that one even thinks of clothes. So that was her entry on Charlayne after this interview. And I was just struck by the beautiful humanity of that, and how that shows us the complexity of Charlayne Hunter-Gault, the iconic American journalist as we think of her. That little entry talks about Charlayne as someone who could be fashionable enough to make the iconic African-American feminist writer Alice Walker feel self-conscious and dowdy, if only for a moment, right? And it also reminds me of what I know about Charlayne, that complexity of her as someone who is, who as a young journalist could be so black and so proud that she could walk into a Black Panther meeting and earn their respect and trust as a journalist because she knew how to come correct, as she might put it. And at the same time, she could also be the personification of the Gibson girl, which, as you may know, was kind of the pretty American girl next door. And that's what Alice Walker called her in that entry, that she was like the Gibson girl. So I think this entry just reminds me of the complexity of Charlayne as both journalist and activist. someone who has modeled for us a career of someone who could be an impartial, effective journalist, but also be an advocate for social justice and human rights. Of course, knowing that while you have to report all sides of a story, it's also okay to take a side, to stand on the right side of history, as Charlayne has so often done, because you understand that while the moral arc of the universe is long, it does indeed, as Dr. King says, bend toward justice. And I think that's the wonderful example that Charlayne has modeled for us all these years as journalists and activists. So I just want to say thank you to you, Charlayne. Effervescent Gibson girl, fashionable icon, and amazing journalist and activist. Thank you for modeling that for us.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for those remarks. That was really fascinating to hear the diary entry. Thank you. Valerie and I used to be colleagues at the AJC, too, before she went into teaching. Next, I want Tom Johnson to speak and talk about his relationship with Charlayne then and now and whatever else he wants to say.
There are seats down front for those of you who are at the back and may be having some difficulty with hearing. I just urge you to come up and take them. We've got a terrific audiovisual team, probably the best you could imagine, but this room doesn't necessarily work too well at the back. So if you aren't hearing, please think about moving forward. Otherwise, we will call on you to speak. As a young reporter for the Macon Telegraph and News, and also the University of Georgia campus newspaper, the Red and Black, I covered Charlayne Hunter, and it was Charlayne Hunter then, and Hamilton Holmes during those traumatic days as they became the first African-American students to be admitted to the University of Georgia. Sadly, I heard some students shout the N-word, "Go home." I watched as one student tried to spit at or on Charlayne. He missed. I was in front of Myers Hall when a student hurled a brick at Charlayne's dorm room window. Thankfully, it missed Charlayne, but it did some damage to the window. I was present when reporters learned about a woman student who allegedly welcomed Charlayne to her dorm by saying, "Honey, we sure are glad to have you here. We have needed a maid to clean up for a long time." And very sadly for me, I was on the staff of the Red and Black when Charlayne came to work there, only to be made felt unwelcomed by a few, but not all, of the student newspaper staff. Several of us did befriend her, and lifetime friendships developed, such as hers with Marcia Powell, and I could name many more. Through it all, Charlayne showed uncommon courage, dignity, and composure. She walked quietly through the campus. She attended classes. She excelled academically. She made friends. And as you well know, she became a heroic but quiet pioneer in the civil rights movement of the 60s. An outstanding reporter for the New York Times, for PBS, and for CNN, Charlayne became one of the very finest journalists, not just in the nation, but in the world. She observed and reported on the inhumane conditions of the apartheid regimes in South Africa and did a remarkable interview with Nelson Mandela. Over the years, her voice reached millions on National Public Radio, NPR. Then her voice and her image reached even more millions on PBS and CNN, which then, as now, was covering most of the land surface of the planet with, I believe at the time, on 7 different satellites. As always, and I really emphasize always, Charlayne has been devoted to excellence, to truth, and to fairness. And with that, she gained the respect of readers, of listeners, and viewers around the world. Today's news world is very different from the world that Charlayne and I entered in the 60s. Many newspapers and magazines have closed, including quite a few in our state of Georgia, some of which, like in my hometown of Macon, are really almost a shell of itself today. Much of that has happened because just the dramatic shift of readers and advertisers from print to electronic platforms. As a result, too many of what I call the watchdog reporters, the watchdogs have gone silent. Thankfully, a few of the largest and strongest newspapers, such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and now my old newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, are doing their best to convert their print subscribers to digital, and I should say to you, there is hope. And I particularly want to mention that here in Atlanta, the AJC does a splendid job on investigative reporting, thank goodness. Courage by journalists today is needed, I think, as never before. Courageous journalists like Charlayne are needed as never before. As you know, we have a president who attacks the media almost every day. My own CNN seems to be at the very top of his list. And even though we have had these proceedings for the last few weeks, and it appears certain that he will not be removed from office, it's really been a very, very adversarial time. And I'm sure most of you just really, no matter what your political positions, are very, very aware of that. Partisan politics has trumped civility and bipartisanship. How we need somehow, some way to restore civility and bipartisanship. Reporters, and particularly reporters for responsible media, are being called fake news, and even worse, and some of you may share that view. Reporters actually today are probably more at physical danger here at home, where they always have been in the field, in the battlefields around the world. I am exceptionally pleased that the Ivan Allen School, the Ivan Allen Jr. Social Courage Award is being awarded to my friend Charlayne. I mean, if there's anybody I think that deserves it, it is she. I did not know Hamilton as well, but the two of them really went through an unbelievable saga, and they have sort of paved the way for such outstanding people as we have on this stage today, and so many more. As I said, nobody deserves it more, and I'm very, very proud to be here today to honor Charlayne. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Tom. Appreciate your being here to share those.
I have other stories about her.
Yeah?
I did observe her romance on campus, too.
Did you? Don't go there. Okay. That's right. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and go to Dr. Arthur Yancey, who is also a former classmate with me at Washington High School and has a legacy himself, his family in Atlanta. And he's going to talk a little bit about the impact that Hamilton Holmes has had on his life and career, et cetera, and his courage.
Appreciate it, Alexis, and to be invited to pay tribute to the life of friend and colleague Hamilton Earl Holmes, who represents the epitome of social contribution to Atlanta and the nation and the world, is indeed a privilege and a distinct honor for which I'm extremely appreciative. The details of why we're here honoring Hamilton have been recounted many times, and I like I want to emphasize the relationship and how I knew Hamp and how far back generationally that relationship goes. First, I can say that he showed early academic promise when he graduated, reflected by graduating from Atlanta's premier African-American high school, Henry McNeil Turner High School, to be contested only by Booker T. Washington High School, which was nearby. Oh,
Yes.
all right, we got that straight, you see. And he graduated valedictorian in 1959, was president of his junior and senior classes. But I'm sure, knowing Hamp Holmes, he was most proud of the fact that he co-captained the football team and captained the basketball team, because Hamp's life and our relationship was based around sports, see, at first. Okay. He did a year and a half at Morehouse College, was an active member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, and then integrated the University of Georgia, the details of which have been recounted and are recounted throughout the media, both written and electronic. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa, continuing that tradition of academic excellence, then went on to integrate the Emory University School of Medicine, matriculating there in 1963 and graduating in 1967. He interned at what was then known as Detroit Receiving Hospital, which was the public hospital in Detroit, and Detroit's Grady Hospital, if you will. And then began his training in orthopedic surgery at Emory University School of Medicine back here in Atlanta until 1969, when he joined the U.S. Army and as a major began his service and was a ranger stationed in Germany. In terms of his medical career after that, he entered the practice of orthopedic surgery as a private orthopedic surgeon, but was soon convinced, and I'm proud of the fact that my father, who was medical director of Grady Hospital before Hamp, convinced that he should come back to Emory University School of Medicine and Grady Hospital, which he did, and became the medical director of the hospital as well as the chief of service in orthopedic surgery there. His legacy looms large with all of us now and is one that we couldn't be more proud of. Trustee of the University of Georgia Foundation in '83, co-namesake of the Holmes Hunter Academic Building, university-sponsored Holmes Hunter Lecture beginning in '85, co-awarded the Bicentennial Medallion in 1985, and then the Hamilton Holmes Endowed Professorship in 1999 at University of Georgia. Going on to his legacy at Emory University, the annual Hamilton E. Holmes Lecture Series carries on with outstanding speakers each and every year, and the Hamilton Holmes Hall Dormitory named after him. In terms of his stamp on Greater Atlanta, the Hamilton E. Holmes Elementary School in East Point, the Hamilton E. Holmes Drive Northwest on the west side of Atlanta, and the H.E. Holmes MARTA Station are part of the legacy that he leaves and the stamp that he leaves that's with us always. It heartens me greatly to see family here, those who could come. He was born in Atlanta in 1941 to Mr. Alfred and Ms. Isabella Holmes, the eldest of 5 offspring, with deceased Gary Holmes coming next, and then Mr. Herbert Holmes, whom we have with us, and Mr. Michael Holmes, who was a great deal of assistance and help with me in gaining some of the details that I passed along. And then a daughter, Ms. E. Lauren Holmes, who's based in New York City. He was married to Ms. Marilyn Vincent Holmes, who's here with us today, and whom I'm proud of and appreciate her carrying on the legacy that I'm talking to you about today. And they have son Hamilton E. Holmes Jr., who graduated from the University of Georgia, and a daughter, Allison Holmes Johnson, whom I hope is with us, but I haven't seen yet. Okay, good. And then their 4 grandchildren, and sadly, Hamilton left us in October of 1995, and all too early, but having left a larger-than-life legacy with us. Now, the relationship that I had with Hamilton Holmes began in Tuskegee, Alabama, where I was born and went through school at Chambliss Children's House up through 4th grade before we moved here to my father's home of Atlanta. Hamilton and his brother Herbert, who's with us today, were at Chambliss Children's House also in Tuskegee from 1953 to 1955, related to the fact that Ms. Illabella Holmes' home was Tuskegee, Alabama, and Herbert helped me realize that, and I didn't know that yet. But that's where I first met Hamilton Holmes as a child myself, when both of us were children, and through my father met him. But it wasn't until Atlanta later on that I realized how far back the relationship between the two families went. Hamilton Holmes' grandfather, who inspired him to become a doctor, a physician himself, knew my grandfather on Beckwith Street. My father knew Hamilton Holmes' grandfather, the physician, knew Hamilton Holmes' father, the businessman, and knew Hamilton Holmes, the student, and the physician. And I knew Hamilton Holmes' father and Hamilton Holmes, and then later Marilyn and the children, so that this is how things began. And the actual getting to know the person, Hamilton Holmes, began on the basketball courts of Atlanta during the 60s. Many times in the summer heat with no shade, and yet all there was to combat that was towels and jars of iced tea. And there were hours, 3 to 5 in an afternoon, where we kept in shape and learned how to work together on those basketball courts. And the attributes that come to mind that prevailed, that showed me what Hamilton Holmes was made of, was the confidence he showed, the leadership on the court, and his self-control even in heated moments. And believe me, playground basketball offered plenty, right? The conflict resolution and his ability to unfailingly unravel the heated moments that happened on those courts, and the interpersonal skills which he had and which is part of his natural personality. And then a bomb to the tensions that were happening in Athens. And when he was in Atlanta on the weekends and we were in pickup basketball, you would never know all that he was going through in Athens, Georgia, in the struggles that we've heard about and we'll hear more about today. And then later on, after my father retired in '89 and after I moved back to Atlanta in '93, I was a colleague of Hamilton Holmes, and he was a medical director at that time. I was a new emergency physician in the section of emergency medicine, which was struggling mightily to become the department it finally became in 1998. And his leadership and self-control in meetings where I was came through again and again and again. The conflict resolution and his unfailing interpersonal skills led Grady through the tough times that all of us here have known about. But then the last times that I interfaced with Hamilton was actually in our preparation for the medical care during the Olympics. And I can remember at the meetings over at the Academy of Medicine on Spring Street, how he could sit there quietly and yet always had the best interests of Grady Hospital in mind, being responsible for it, and the controversies that were being brought up about what Grady's participation in the Olympic medical care effort were to be. So that this was the Hamilton homes that I've known, and I certainly appreciate Alexis and the committee here inviting me to talk about Ham and all that he contributed to all of us sitting here and the wider world of Atlanta, the nation, and the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. And now I want Dr. Michelle Garfield Cook, who is the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion and Strategic University Initiatives, the Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Georgia. So I'd like for you to make some opening comments about the Georgia then and now, perhaps.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity and for the committee for the opportunity to be here today. I, like Dr. Boyd, find this a unique honor because being born and raised in Atlanta and growing up in Southwest Atlanta, where among the many heroes and sheroes of the civil rights movement, Charlayne, Hunter, and Hamilton Holmes was often talked about in my family, in our house, in terms of the fact that you can do anything. You can be anyone you want to be, and that you shouldn't let barriers exclude that because of their experience. At the University of Georgia, the impact and the legacy of Hamilton Holmes and Charlayne Hunter-Gault on our campus, throughout the community, and across the Bulldog Nation cannot be overstated. Holmes Hunter, for us, transcends the two individuals whose name it bears, as well as the specifics of their sacrifice, the victory that they won, and the change that they forged. For us on campus, it's a noun, it's a verb, it's a call to action, a validation of who we are, why we are there, and our very right to be so. For African Americans at UGA, Holmes Hunter is the beginning of our genealogical tree, our own Adam and Eve, if you will. A tree that expands now to include over 13,000 living Black alumni. In tangible terms, it's a building, the Holmes Hunter Academic Building, perhaps one of the most iconic buildings on campus, the one that everyone sees when they walk through the famed University of Georgia Arch. You see it is the building that housed the very administrative offices that sought to bar their enrollment at the University of Georgia. Holmes Hunter is also the annual lecture that has been mentioned, professorships, and so much more. But the question then becomes, how do we take the multiple meanings, the vast and diverse interpretations of the legacy of Hamilton Holmes and Charlayne Hunter-Gault and translate them to guide, direct, and fuel contemporary issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion on a campus in the 21st century? Thinking about diversity and inclusion in higher education, there's so many directions that this can take. There's so many areas of inclusion and that need the attention and need action. I would suggest, though, that the core issue that they sought to address in the early 1960s remains a central issue of concern and contestation in higher education today, and that is access. Allow me a moment to put this in historical context, particularly as it pertains to African Americans in the United States. Holmes Hunter stands as representatives of a long and contested history of Blacks fighting in various arenas for the right to be educated. This is a history that we all know has roots in slavery, when state laws prohibited the education of Blacks, often both slave and free. There were severe and immediate penalties for Blacks engaging in the basic activity of learning. Yet we all know that they did it anyway. They engaged in a variety of subversive, often guerrilla activities in order to simply learn how to read and write, often write their own name in a way to validate, I am here, I exist. Access. This is access to education. Knowing that education has the capacity to change lives, communities, to empower individuals, and enable generations to come. This history of fighting for access is the sub-theme of the civil rights movement. Yet today, we don't necessarily see it as the same because the laws have changed. But the translation for higher education today is the conversation regarding who belongs in higher education, who deserves to have access, particularly to some of our most elite institutions, and who has the capacity to be successful. In plain terms, who's college material today? The issue of access and its denial looks very different in the 21st century. But I would argue that it is salient as today for thousands of, if not millions of young people, as it was in 1961, when Holmes and Hunter arrived on the campus of the University of Georgia to register for classes. So how is it different? Barriers to access today now take the form of escalating financial costs that turn into debilitating student loan debt, a debt that is defining a generation of young people and the life decisions that they make. Barriers to access are now reflected in the rhetoric and reality of academic preparation and an achievement gap that slams the door of higher education access years before someone is ready to matriculate into college. And finally, a particularly disturbing challenge to access is a growing culture of anti-intellectualism that is questioning the very value and therefore the need for higher education. As rational people, we know that no one wants to embark on a multi-year project that you can't afford, you're told constantly and consistently that you don't have the capacity to succeed in, and you, nor those around you whose opinions you trust, are not convinced that it has any value or benefit for you anyway. I think that it's critical that as we continue to celebrate how far we have come, and we have indeed come incredibly far, that we not declare victory yet. The simple issue of access, one that was so starkly obvious in what Hamilton Holmes and Charlayne Hunter-Gault were able to accomplish, is still a battle to be fought. But I'm optimistic. And whenever I reflect on the legacy of their battle and the significance of their accomplishment, I am encouraged. Events like this one provide us opportunities to stay engaged in these issues that are critical to our success and our future and the success of future generations, as critical as it was 60 years ago. And I am also encouraged because as individuals who care about higher education, who care about access and diversity and inclusion, it is critical that we stay engaged in this issue, that we continue to have these conversations, and we continue to build on the incredible legacy left by Charlayne Hunter-Gault and Dr. Hamilton Holmes. Thank you.
All right, and that brings us to Judge Steve Jones, who's the United States District Federal Court, U.S. District Court for the Northern District. I guess a mouthful, but
Thank you.
please, thank you.
First of all, I'll say thank you. It's a great honor and privilege and pleasure to be on a panel honoring Ms. Hunter-Gault and Dr. Holmes. I graduated from the University of Georgia from an undergraduate degree and a law degree, and I would not have been able to do that without you all. You are pioneers to set the way that made it possible for me today. And a lot of times I remind my young law clerks that there's a lot of things that they have a privilege to do today because they stand on the shoulders of other people. So I want to salute you all today and thank you. I've been asked to talk about diversity in the legal profession. And the question is, why is that important? Why is it important to have diversity in the legal profession? I'm reminded of a photo that I go back and look at a lot. There's Ms. Hunter-Gault, Dr. Holmes, and on one side is Don Hollowell. And on the other side is Horace Ward. And behind them is Vernon Jordan. And back at the office is Constance Baker Motley writing the brief, okay? And they're with them every step of the way. The law played a major part in their admissions and a lot of things that followed after that. But I also want to remind you one other thing. On the right-hand side of you, Ms. Hunter-Gault, is Horace Ward. Later become Judge Horace Ward, the first African-American district court judge in the Northern District of Georgia, which includes Metro Atlanta, all up to the Tennessee line and North Carolina, Alabama. But also, Involved in this procedure was Constance Baker Motley, who became a United States District Court judge, first African-American female United States District Court judge in the Southern District of New York. The diversity started with you all. Why is it important? As indicated, the law played such an important part in not only the application and admissions, but as Dr. Bootle pointed out, in enforcing what the Constitution guaranteed everybody. However, we have not progressed as much as I would like, as much as any of us would like in the legal profession. We made progress, but our progress has been slow. Let me give you examples. In 2007, women made up 30% of the legal profession. 10 years later, in 2017, slightly increased from 30% to 35%. Even though women make up 51% of the females make up 51% of the population in America. But even more startling is that in 2007, people that identified themselves as black or African American made up 4% of the legal profession. 10 years later, in 2017, it increased 1% to 5%. Individuals who identified themselves as Latino or Hispanic made up 4% also in 2007. And also, 10 years later, it only increased 1% to 5%. Now, you ask yourself, why is that? The major law firms. Out of over 300 major law firms in America, roughly 9.2% of the partners, people that make the decisions, the hiring decisions, the compensation decisions, are minorities. Those figures are hurting because our young people and the population look at these figures. And I also must say, in my profession, as a judge, as an Article III judge, an Article III judge is someone nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. 1,302 active and senior Article III judges in America in 2017. 265 were minorities. 142 African American, 92 Latino, Hispanic, 29 Asian. When people come in our courtrooms, my courtroom, they look at who's sitting there. But when minorities come in those courtrooms, they also view who's sitting there. What's the effect of this slow progress in the legal profession? Well, respect for the law is one of the issues we have to deal with. I tell my wife a lot of nights, I have jury trials at least 1 week out every month. And I tell my wife, I go home and I tell her about some of the reasons people don't want to serve on jury duty. And sometimes I have to pick up off the floor from laughing. But it's not funny, because when there's respect for the law, you understand the importance of civic responsibility. When there's respect for the law, there's no resistance to the law. I'm 5'11", and I'm 160 pounds after a real good meal, okay? But upon my signature, government agencies will stop doing things. Corporations can be brought to a stop and injunctions and stays. And it's not because of their fear of my muscle, but it's because of respect for the law. But the lack of diversity in the legal profession is causing an erosion of that respect. Our country is only as strong, and this is a biased opinion from a lawyer, okay? It's only as strong as our legal profession. I built a house many years ago. And one thing I learned in building that house is that the foundation was the most important part. The legal profession, the enforcement of the Constitution, the laws, is only as strong as respect for the law. What else happens when we don't have legal diversity in our country? Trust for the law erodes. People have to believe that they will be treated fairly when they come to court or when they're in our system. The legitimacy of the laws that we enforce and pass is only as good as the trust the individuals have in our legal system. I watch how individuals react to our legal system, and it hurts my heart a lot to see that trust is eroding. Because individuals, the interpretation of the law, the background of the law is based on the experience of the individuals that are enforcing it. And when individuals see where a prosecutor is drawing up indictments that indict one set of people and let other set of people not be indicted, the trust factor is hurt. When the legal diversity is shown to be lacking, trust is lacking. It is very important that you all and the public have a perception that the law is fair. One of the greatest things anyone ever said to me after a bench trial was that, Judge, I don't agree with your ruling, but I felt I was treated fair. That lack of diversity have less people saying that. Lack of diversity also causes an issue for us that we're not a better legal system unless we have more people involved. I was told one time by an appellate judge, Dr. Cook, there was another appellate judge and their legal opinions were that far apart. But he said, I love her. So why? You don't get along on anything. It is needed for her opinion to be there so my opinion can be looked at. And sometimes I can change my opinion by knowing her background. So how do we change this? How do we make the law better? How do we make the legal profession more diverse? Well, first of all, we have to start with our law schools. We have to make sure there's more inclusion in our law schools. And I understand there's a situation where there are certain confinements on the law that affirmative action cannot be used exactly the same way. I have to enforce a lot of those laws. There's a lot of reverse discrimination laws. But however, our law schools can become more inclusive. We also have to make a point of inclusion. And that starts with attitude. And attitude does not necessarily start with lawyers and judges. It starts with the public. The public can determine what we do a lot of times and how we do it. To become a United States District Court judge, become a United States Appellate Court judge, become a United States Supreme Court justice, it's not as a result of an election. It's a result of a nomination through a political process. And that political process is often influenced by you, the public. So therefore, the final thing we have to do is, as the public, we must celebrate inclusion. We must demand inclusion. The foundation for America is strong. And again, from a bias and prejudice point of view, but it's only as strong as the laws and the legal profession that uphold it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, panel, for those opening remarks. I've just been very impressed and in awe of all of you and your experiences and your relationship to social courage. I want to know if anyone heard anything that sparked a thought from the other panel members before I ask you a specific. No? All right. Oh, I'm asking if there was anything that you heard during the panel presentations that sparked a thought that you wanted to share.
Well, I would just make a point that while there were students who were, I thought, in times endangering Charlayne during her early days and months at the University of Georgia, Hamilton Holmes, the very athletic former football player, star, not a lot of people messed around with him. And it said something, though I thought about just the enormous difference at times between, at that stage, between the way in which perhaps women were treated and men were treated. And that was something that was quite obvious to me. So you obviously, in those days back here on the court, basketball courts, you've got him in really good shape to deal with his early years at Georgia.
Right. What I'd like to get someone to opine about is how you think the impact of the resistance to desegregation impacted the people who were resisting. I mean, what was wrong with them? Any thoughts on that? What makes people, maybe the diversity officer can help us, what makes people be crazy like that? I mean, when I was in diversity at Cox, they said it was about fear of the other and that your limbic things, your brain shuts down and it's a fight or flight kicks in. Is that what you think was going on, or what was going on? And what's going on now? Dr. Cook, get us started.
Well, that is always a very interesting question, but also my academic background is as a historian, and one of the things that we can see as we look across history is that people often act in their own best interest and their perception of what that means. And so what we see when we look at the activities and the actions and the responses, particularly of students and other individuals who were engaged at that time, that they were acting in their own best interest and what they perceived and what was their long-term best interest. You mentioned there's some psychological components such as fear and what may happen with the brain. But one of the things that I think is really encouraging from this discussion this morning is listening, even with the video of Mayor Ivan Allen, listening to some of the conversations that went on in the Bootle household around this issue, is to realize that there always is an opportunity for people to do the right thing. And that there are always people in whatever era, whatever time, whatever identity, there's going to be people who identify an opportunity to do the right thing and become leaders in their circles. And it definitely sounds like Judge Bootle, as well as Mayor Allen, were those types of individuals to lead people to a new understanding of what the future can hold, to move them beyond that attitude and that trap of fear and kind of that concern about their own self-serving interests, and to see what is going to be moving forward for best for the community and for the society. And so I'm really encouraged by hearing about those individuals in the past and knowing that even in today, we have to be those people who can see beyond our own self-interest and our own benefit and to see what the issues are so that we can move forward.
Oh, thank you. But their own self-interest, to me, would be to do the opposite of what they did. Because if you hate somebody, you're going to make them hate you back. I mean, it doesn't sound like a good, reasonable response to me, but you mean their immediate self-interest? Or what do you think about that, Tom?
I am really striving to stay very much nonpartisan. I'm trying my best because I know that there are people here who have strong views on both sides of some of the issues that we're discussing. I mean, I come out of a period of time working for President Johnson when we had extraordinary bipartisanship, when we were trying to put through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. We had spectacular support, of course, from Dr. King and the African American community, strong backing from the Jewish community, unbelievable support from the labor movement. But in order to make it happen, we really had to reach across the aisles to Everett Dirksen and then Congressman Gerald Ford, and had an incredible ability to work together for just the passage not only of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but Medicaid. I'm reminded that the doctors at the time, I know some of you might feel sensitivity about this, but the doctors certainly did not want Medicare at the time. But we had this ability to work together. and it doesn't seem to exist today in the highest reaches of our capital in Washington or our state capital. I so hope that we can find a way to reunite America. I mean, that we can find a way to bring the good people on both sides together. There's still a center in America that cares so much, I think, about our commitment to civil rights, our commitment to voting rights. But you can see there's also just this aggregation to, pardon the expression, there's this aggregation of pissed off people. And it's a huge aggregation, and they represent a large percentage of America today in the 40% range. And I don't know what we can do except what you said, that those people who believe in doing what is right, do it, and serve as an example for the younger generations that are coming on. I worry that the judges of the future, who are not chosen by Barack Obama, but are chosen after they pass a test by the Federalist Society, may be the ones that are chosen to go into our courts in the future. Now, we have a responsibility. Media, religion, law, medicine, you name it. We really have because this is a group of people here in this room who care and care deeply about these issues. And in our own way, whether it's the word is resistance or advocacy, we've got to advocate and support what is right. And we've got to do all we can in our schools, public and private, and in our families to try to help move America, hopefully, forward, but forward to what was really a period of time of bipartisanship and people working together. I'm still optimistic that it can be done, but there are days like last night when I wasn't so sure. But I also should say, because I should really say this, I didn't think it was a good thing that the speaker tore up the president's speech in public last night. I mean, I just didn't feel that was a good thing. But I also felt that it was a mistake when the speaker reached out her hand to at least show some sign of reconciliation with the president, that he either missed her hand coming out or just ignored it. So that's a long ending to what I hope. Thank you.
All right. What you want to say about that, Arthur?
Alexis, I think there's a common thread with what Judge Jones was saying in opportunity. We in medicine now are struggling with the huge issue that's coming out with population studies, that outcomes for the treatment of disease when it's broken down by race is worse across the board in African Americans. And it's going to take the diversity of providers that Judge Jones was talking about in order to remedy that, not only in terms of the technical care that each of us as patients gets, but also in terms of the confidence we have that the outcomes will be the best possible. So that I appreciate in any field, medicine, law, journalism, and more, what both Ms. Hunter and Dr. Holmes did.
All right. Do we have some questions from the audience now? I see a hand. Yes.
Can we get a mic to the audience so everybody can hear? He's on his way. He can take mine. Probably a lot of people would like mine to be taken away.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Holmes, the brother of Hamilton Holmes. I would like for you to just consider that there were people that came before Hamp and Charlayne that kind of set a pattern. My father, grandfather, and uncle decided in 1951 that they had had enough, and they decided that they were going to go and try and fully enjoy the rights of a citizen and tried to integrate the Bobby Jones golf course. From that particular effort in 1951, they wound up winning a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1955 that integrated public parks. A lot of people don't know that, but HAMP did not fall from a blank tree. There was a tree, and there's a tree for all of us in one way or the other. We are our environment. We come from people that lead us in certain kinds of directions. I am so glad that we've been able to bring Charlayne Hunter-Gault, who was a family friend since junior high school. Well, they didn't have junior high schools back then, but from those particular days, best friend of my brother. You could not have asked for a better pair to go and have to deal with the craziness that they had to deal with in those first several days, weeks, and months of going to the University of Georgia. My brother used to come home on the weekend just for his own sanity, because he had people around him that loved him. So coming home to people that care, or people expressing their care for you, is such an important part of maintaining good mental health. It's so critically important that we recognize that we come from people that have fought through lots and lots of things to get us to where we are today. And hopefully this symposium will open some more eyes, will create some more sense of there is more to be done, and that regardless of what we see on a national political level, we have an opportunity to reach across the aisle and touch each other in such a way that it makes good sense politically, economically, socially, and hopefully we will be able to make something happen like that. I love the fact that you're doing this, the Ivan Allen Prize, 25 years after my brother passed away, but better late than never. Thank you so very much.
Anybody want to comment? Dr. Cook, you want to comment on that?
I would just like to make a point to reiterate what Mr. Holmes, what he has said, that the work of unearthing the many stories and the multiple sheroes and heroes that upon whose shoulders we stand is a continuing work. At the University of Georgia, we do have the Foot Soldiers Project, and we do have Dr. Maurice Daniels is here with us today. We're very honored. He's a former dean of our School of Social Work and has done a lot of work in terms of unearthing those stories and providing more information about what is happening. He recently published a book on the integration of Georgia State University, which for us in this kind of the local Atlanta area is a continuation of the stories of recognizing those who've come before us and upon whose shoulders we stand. So I appreciate your comment, Mr. Holmes.
Thank you, and thanks, Mike. I didn't recognize you from here. I have macular degeneration in addition to my knees, but thank you.
There must be other questions, hot questions out in that audience. Where are they? Brad, hey.
Yes.
So I really liked your question about why do people do these crazy things? Why do people act in the way that they do? And it's something that I've thought about a lot as a mom. I've got 3 children, one who's asking me questions all the time. Why do people act this way? And I go back to a lot, there's the original Milgram study that showed what people were capable of. People were tested in a psychological study, kind of got at that question of how could good people do awful things? And I think what it comes back to is that every human is capable of goodness and every human is capable of badness. And I loved what Sam Nunn said in the video at the beginning. It's just doing the next right thing. And I think that a lot of people, there's social dynamics, there's many different variables that go into the decisions that we make. But I try and tell my daughter, you're not a bad person. I think she's a good person. I think she's a good person. But it's the choices that you make, and that's how you show who you are. And I think to Tom's point about how do we get back to crossing these boundaries that feel impossible, and it's just making that next right thing and doing the right choice moment to moment. And I think that's what makes these bigger issues better over time. But we all have it within us, and I think that it's more important now than ever to understand I am capable of doing horrible things, but I'm going to make the choice not to. I am capable of doing wonderful things, and I'm going to make the choice to do that. And if we see that in each other and recognize that, it helps us to forgive the mistakes that we make and to celebrate the good choices. So,
Thank you. Appreciate that comment. Oh, was it? Judge
Hi.
Tuttle's granddaughter.
Am I next? Okay, thank you. Would you all comment on your preparation for Georgia at the high school level? Because as I recall, there were maybe 7 all-black high schools in Atlanta back in the 60s and the 50s, and Turner High and Washington High stood heads and shoulders above the rest. Can you comment on how well you were prepared in high school to face what you faced at Georgia?
Is that a question for Charlayne?
It's a question for all of the, Charlayne can start, but
For the panel.
Dr. Yancey, if you want to comment on that, or others who were in high school in Atlanta during those days.
Okay.
How well prepared were you coming out of high school to take on this effort at the University of Georgia, University of Michigan, wherever you were involved?
Okay. So the question is, how well prepared were students coming out of black high schools to meet the challenge? That's a Charlayne's question. But I'll tell you.
I can address that. I went to Atlanta Public Schools. The maligned now Atlanta Public Schools in some ways. My high school education was at Harper High School, which is in the same little triangle as Hamilton Homes MARTA Station now. That was our home MARTA Station. But also Turner High School, Booker T. Washington. And what I discovered in becoming an undergrad student at an elite college like Northwestern University, what I discovered and have come to appreciate more and more as a professor now at University of Georgia is how well prepared those mostly black women teachers in Atlanta Public Schools, how much they prepared me for my life as ultimately a writer, first as a student, then as a writer, then as a scholar and professor. And so from what I've read about your journey too, Charlayne, I think, and with Hamp as well, that we were prepared by the teachers in our communities and by the people that you mentioned, Mr. Holmes, the other people in our community, not just the teachers, but the community members who nurtured and loved us and made us feel that we could, we could go for whatever those dreams might be. But I felt somewhat surprised. I remember the talk in my high school was, you go to the segregated, all-black high school because there had been white flight by the time I was in high school. I graduated from high school in 1981. So there had been the white flight. So the concern among those black teachers was, you need to be ready, you need to be better than, so that you can compete wherever you want to go. And I remember going to, between junior and senior year of high school, I was chosen for the Governor's Honors Program. And that was my first time sitting side by side with white students. And what I realized that summer was, they're not that smart. Like, I can hang with, we're equals here. But my fear was that because we were in under-resourced schools, I wouldn't be able to compete and that sort of thing. And that discovery in high school, no, I'm as smart as they are. gave me the kind of confidence to even apply to a school like Northwestern and to end up going there. And I was encouraged very specifically to do that by some of my high school teachers, because initially I wanted to go to Howard because that was one of the top black high schools, and that was what I saw as my future. And I remember specifically a teacher, Mrs. Taylor, pulling me aside and saying, Howard is great, apply to Howard, but also apply to Harvard. And I was surprised at that. What do you mean Harvard? And she was like, you have the potential to do this. So that kind of nurturing from our teachers, those black women and men in those high schools, I think really did prepare my generation for the challenges ahead. And Charlayne, you want to comment on that?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm looking at the panel moderator. Is it okay?
Yes, you may, but I've been given the rap
I'm going to make it real quick. I only have 8 minutes at lunch, so I'm going to do 1 minute now.
It's all right. Go ahead.
Because I want to pick up on what both Tom and Valerie and this amazing panel, which brought tears to my eyes as well as pride to my heart. 85% of the schools in this country do not teach black history. That has been documented by many organizations that study this. And my concern is I'm proud of the fact that our schools did for Valerie and for Hamilton and me what they did, provided with what I call armor. But they are not teaching young white students this history, so that when we have fear today among white students and white parents and the white community about becoming a minority in this country in the next 20 or 30 years, what is missing is the beauty of our black history and the fact that there's nothing to fear. And so my argument today, whenever I have an opportunity, is to say whatever we can do to get our black history into our schools to show that this is American history and something that all of us, regardless of our color or our politics, should be proud of. I want to take that opportunity to do that.
Great. Thank you for that. And before I thank the panel, I want to put in my 2 cents on that question. When I was in high school with Arthur, our teachers had PhDs from Columbia University, UCLA, Berkeley, all over the country, Chicago, because they could not go to graduate school in Georgia because of segregation. The state paid their tuition to go to these graduate schools. So they were very well qualified and prepared to teach us. And they also had the knowledge of segregation and their own personal experience to share with us too. So that made us, I guess, better prepared in some ways. But now let me thank this panel, this wonderful panel. Thank you so much. They have exemplified the Ivan Allen Jr. Social Courage Award in their own careers and in their own observations. So thank you again. And we want to thank the Glenn Family Foundation for their support for this program too. Thank you.